At 07:42, the sun burned through the low mist hanging over Pope Army Airfield. The morning's final live-fire exercise had just wrapped, and a jammed M4A1 lay discarded near the edge of the range. Emily Graves stepped forward without a word. Her boots moved steady over concrete stained with brass and dust. Sleeves rolled to her elbows. Torque wrench clipped to her belt. And not a single expression on her face. Most of the operators barely noticed her at first. She was always there. Quiet, gray in presence, no rank on her coveralls. A DoD contractor attached to weapons support. She rarely spoke unless directly asked a technical question. Her reputation floated in half-formed sentences, that woman who never smiles. Never jokes, never joins the crew at the canteen. A few chuckles started when she knelt beside the jammed weapon. The problem was basic. A spent casing stuck in the chamber, but it was enough of an excuse. One of the younger guys leaned toward his teammate, voice raised just enough. Bet she Googles how to fix a rifle. Laughter followed, easy and sharp, like wolves scenting weakness. Emily didn't look up. She inspected the rifle with a motion that was practiced, deliberate. Ejection port open, charging handle half-cocked, magazine dropped cleanly, buffer assembly intact. Her left thumb braced the upper while she used a carbon scraper to clear, fouling near the bolt lugs. Every movement was silent, efficient, controlled. Master Sergeant Ray Coleman took a step forward, boots crunching over gravel. He stood 6'2", all bulk and swagger, the kind of NCO who'd been in too long to question himself anymore. His voice cut through the haze like a blade. "You need us to color code the instructions for you." "Sweetheart." He gestured to the rifle with mockery in his tone. "Maybe you'd have better luck with a Swiffer instead of a weapon." The team laughed harder. Some turned away, uncomfortable. Others leaned in to enjoy the spectacle. Emily remained still, her hands on the rifle, focus fixed on the chamber and feed ramps. She used a bore light next, checking for residual debris. Not once did she acknowledge the crowd. Coleman moved closer, crouched beside her, his voice now lower. Intimate in the worst way. "Seriously, this is an elite range. We don't have time for hobbyists pretending to be armorers. Why don't you head back to admin and polish someone's boots?" The last word was practically spat. Emily adjusted her grip. The carbon scraper clicked once as she released it into her pouch. Her right hand reached for a dental pick, running it between the bolt face and extractor lip. She paused just long enough to let the silence around her settle. A spent casing slid free. She held it up between her gloved fingers for half a second, checked the brass rim, and laid it in the tray beside her without comment. The rifle was functional again. She flipped the dust cover closed and locked the bolt forward with one final motion. Coleman straightened, his smirk faltering just slightly. The moment wasn't explosive. No one gasped. There was no triumphant music, no raised voice, just the absence of any reaction. And that silence, in front of a dozen men trained to detect shifts in threat posture, somehow felt louder than shouting. Emily wiped the receiver group with a microfiber cloth and placed the rifle on the designated rack. Then she stood, gathered her tools, and turned to walk away. A young specialist called after her, tone dripping sarcasm. "Hey, next time maybe bring a user manual. Might save you some effort." She didn't respond. Coleman shook his head, muttering, "I don't know why they let civilians near our ranges. Can't trust someone who's never worn a uniform." One of the older sergeants watched Emily disappear into the shadows of the maintenance building. He'd seen enough calluses on rifle hands to know the difference between a technician and a shooter. He didn't say anything, but he looked at Coleman like maybe the master sergeant didn't know quite as much as he thought. By 0803, the airfield's echo of laughter had faded, and Emily Graves, the simple woman no one respected, was already elbow-deep in a disassembled SIG M17, hands moving with a precision no one dared understand yet. At 0814, the laughter on the range died in an instant. It happened the moment Emily reached overhead to adjust the weapon rack. Her sleeve rode up just far enough to expose a piece of black ink on the inside of her left forearm. Not a butterfly. Not a quote. Not anything you'd see from a weekend warrior. It was clean, military precise. A trident. Not the standard SEAL insignia either. This one was custom. Sharper edges. 4 stars under the tines. Waves etched like scars behind the blades. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It slowed. Like brakes locking just before a crash, eyes followed the shape of the tattoo. Some didn't know what they were looking at. But others, those who'd served long enough to hear stories whispered in tents or during dead hours in barracks, stared like they were watching a ghost surface from water. Coleman froze mid-sentence. His jaw tightened. He looked at the tattoo, then back at her, then blinked. Something passed through his face. Recognition. Maybe. maybe fear. He started to speak again, but nothing came out. One of the junior team leaders muttered something under his breath. Another nudged his buddy and motioned slightly with his chin. The phrase didn't have to be loud. Ghost of Coronado. Nobody laughed now. Not even the ones who hadn't understood what they saw. They felt it. Like animals sense a storm before clouds form. That shift in air pressure, that tightening across the ribs. Emily didn't notice, or maybe she did and chose to pretend. She tugged her sleeve back down, kept her head low, continued logging maintenance reports without once making eye contact. Staff Sergeant Lane stood nearest and couldn't stop staring. He'd seen that symbol once, buried in an annex briefing slide no one was supposed to save. One of those ops so redacted it barely had a name, just a call sign. Ghost. No last name, no photo, only a kill count and a line of citations. He whispered toward the guy on his left. You think it's her? The one from Iron Resolve. The guy didn't answer. Outside, a Blackhawk passed low overhead, rotors thumping a hard rhythm across the sky. Several operators instinctively looked up. Emily didn't move, but Lane noticed the muscle in her jaw twitch. Her hand paused over a field strip checklist, only for a breath. Then it resumed. Someone at the back of the group mumbled something about legends. That one woman, years ago, who made it through the pipeline and vanished after half her team got killed. In northern Afghanistan, they'd called her the Phantom. The command had scrubbed everything. No press, no names, no funerals. Coleman finally stepped back. His face had drained of color, but he tried to rally. She's just a contractor. Don't go myth hunting. Could be anyone. But his voice didn't carry anymore. The confidence was gone. Another NCO cleared his throat, asked quietly, You ever seen that trident variant before? Coleman didn't answer. He just looked away, jaw locked tight. The thing about elite teams, Green Berets, SEALs, Tier 1. They weren't built on salute and shut up culture. These men had fought alongside ghosts. They recognized fear even when it hid behind sarcasm. And what they saw in Coleman wasn't leadership anymore. It was doubt. Emily finished her checklist, logged serial numbers with a dry erase pen on the whiteboard. Her handwriting was exact, almost obsessive. She capped the marker and stepped away from the board without turning around. By 08:22, nobody said anything. Some watched her leave. Others watched Coleman. The room held that strange hush. The one you hear right before something changes, before the myth becomes memory, or worse, truth. Outside, the heat was rising, and Emily disappeared through the side access to the weapons bay. Her steps were even, unhurried. She didn't flinch when someone said her name, but she didn't turn either. Lane exhaled slowly, then whispered again, Ghost isn't supposed to exist. The guy beside him replied, almost reverently, That's why they called her Ghost. The silence held. No one went back to training. Not yet. Because if she really was who they thought she was, then every joke they'd made wasn't just disrespectful. It was a near-death experience they hadn't recognized in time. By 08:27, the only thing louder than the wind was the echo of memory. A name nobody had dared say out loud, a trident that didn't belong to the living, and a simple woman who never needed to raise her voice to command a room full of warfighters. By 05:10 each morning, before the motor pool lights even flickered on, Emily Graves was already inside Bay 6. She never clocked in loudly or greeted the front desk. The security guard stopped checking her badge weeks ago. She moved through the armory like a shadow, work gloves already on, a magnetic tool tray clipped to her hip, coffee cooling untouched beside a wall of spare bolt carriers. No one saw her smile. No one heard her laugh. She skipped the break room. She never touched her phone during shift hours. At noon, when others gathered in the shade beside the Connex boxes for smoke and banter, Emily walked the perimeter alone, one ear tuned to the sound of her boots on gravel, the other to faint irregularities in wind direction. Her lunch was always the same protein bar, black coffee, apple slices, all eaten while inventorying serialized equipment. But it was how she worked that raised questions. When a malfunctioning M17 came in with light primer strikes, she didn't refer to the TM manual or wait for range test data. She chambered a dummy round, listened for hammer drag, and ran the slide 3 times slowly. Her ear caught the sound of sear slip. Her fingers moved immediately to the trigger group housing. She pulled the fire control assembly, checked spring tension, and replaced the striker block without saying a word. She didn't talk about it. She just knew. She could diagnose a bent recoil spring before it coiled halfway. She adjusted front sights on aging M9s by feel alone. When an Air Force combat controller dropped off an MCX spear with feeding issues, Emily had it stripped and scoped before the operator finished explaining the problem. She ran her thumb along the feed ramps, paused at a rough edge, and hit it twice with a diamond file. The others started to notice patterns. She always checked buffer springs with calipers, looking for compression over 0, 6 inches from baseline. Her hands moved with symmetrical precision, like she was performing medical triage, not weapons maintenance. On carbines, she cleaned gas tubes with micro-torqued rods, applied thread locker at just the right torque spec on scope mounts, and always looked at bolt lugs for shear stress lines invisible to the untrained. She never cross-threaded anything. She never over-tightened, and she never guessed. It wasn't just knowledge, it was muscle memory. The way she flicked safeties on and off, the way she cleared chambers by turning her body instead of just the barrel. The instinct to keep her back to a wall and her workspace in view, all of it told a different story. Her movements were less like a technician and more like someone who'd carried these tools into places where mistakes cost lives. She didn't just know these weapons. She'd lived with them, the junior armorers whispered, tried to piece together her background. Civilian resume showed nothing beyond a degree in mechanical engineering and a few contracts overseas with unnamed defense contractors. That could mean anything, or it could mean everything. One contractor swore he saw a scar on her collarbone, something jagged, too wide for surgery and too straight for accident. Another said she'd adjusted his ACOG in 15 seconds flat just from watching his eye flinch during recoil. She'd only said one thing: "Your eye's compensating. That means your 0 is off." They laughed behind her back at first. Then they started watching. And eventually, they just stayed quiet. By 17:20, when others were packing up, Emily was still wiping down bolt faces and checking for burrs on charging. Handles. She never left early. She never rushed. Every piece of gear she worked on left cleaner than it arrived, ready for the kind of field use most people in that building only knew from secondhand reports. She never said where she learned it, and nobody dared ask. At 0347 deep in the shock valley of eastern Afghanistan, Chief Petty Officer Emily Graves, call sign Ghost, staggered through loose shale with a 200-pound man over her shoulders, his blood soaked into her blouse and down the side of her neck. 2 clicks behind her. Taliban fire chased through the ravine like teeth. In her pack were 3 encrypted drives and documents marked burn before capture. Her teammates were dead, and she didn't cry. She didn't even stop. She reached the exfil point at 0419, heart pounding like rotor blades. Her gear weighed close to 70 pounds, not counting Marcus. She made a perimeter using broken scrub and night fog, prepped a red strobe just low enough to avoid line-of-sight exposure, and waited flat against the rocks with a sidearm drawn. They lifted her out in blackout conditions. She never said a word during evac. The first sound she made was handing off Marcus's tags. Years before that, she'd earned her nickname in Somalia. The op ran under total darkness, no night vision permitted. Inside a collapsed marketplace, 12 hostiles had taken a UN staff unit and rigged the perimeter with trip, wires and chemical deterrents. Emily breached from below through drainage access, used her fixed blade to neutralize the guards, and cleared the compound using only sound and muscle memory. 12 confirmed kills. The hostages never saw her face. In Syria, she rerouted a convoy under fire, pushed through the southern corridor outside Al-Hasaka, and coordinated an extraction of 23 American contractors trapped. Between 2 converging militia units, her unit had been recalled. She went in alone. The Pentagon credited the successful recovery to an unconfirmed auxiliary asset. No photo. No name. But every contractor had the same story. Someone moved through the smoke and pulled them out. She was the first woman to pass the crucible. Not the training phase, but the real thing. 72 hours in isolation under simulated capture, sleep deprivation, chemical exposure, and live evasion drills. Most operators failed by hour 36. Emily completed it in 73. They added an hour after she cracked their route log to expose an internal flaw in the training circuit. Her trident wasn't issued. It was awarded in ceremony so private there was no formal record. She never displayed it. The one inked on her arm was personal, with 4 stars in place of laurels. Underneath were 3 names: Chen, Rodriguez, Thompson. Those 3 died in the mountains because someone behind a desk gave the wrong intel. She survived because they held position and covered her retreat. When the Navy offered a silver star, she refused. Medals belong to the dead. The living just carry on. She left active duty a week after returning stateside, walked into the team commander's office, handed over her badge and kit, and never looked back. No press release. No funeral detail. She moved west, changed her hair, dropped off every grid she used to operate on. It wasn't shame that made her disappear. It was grief and a promise. Now she fixes weapons, silently, relentlessly. Each rifle she clears, each optic she calibrates, is done like she's prepping for someone she once loved to go into the breach. The buffer springs, the bolt cams, the tightness of her torque on a sight mount. All of it carries memory, not from books, from blood. Her hands weren't built for tools, but they use them now, because that's all she has left. At 10:06, Master Sergeant Ray Coleman strutted into the weapons bay holding a suppressed SR-25 like it was Exhibit A in some rigged courtroom. The rifle, normally precision-tuned and mission-ready, had been deliberately sabotaged. He set it on Emily's workbench with a thud, loud enough to turn heads, loud enough to send a message. Let's see if you're really as sharp as you pretend to be. The SR-25 was a semi-automatic sniper system, 7.62 NATO, suppressed, with a loopholed optic mounted on a cantilever rail. Emily didn't say a word. She pulled a nitrile glove snug, adjusted her eye protection, and stepped forward. The rifle rested diagonally across the mat, stock tilted slightly as if resisting the inspection. Coleman's voice followed her hands. Take your time. We know thinking isn't your strong suit. She didn't look up. She didn't flinch. She pressed the bolt release. The bolt slid forward, not with the clean, metallic snap it should have had, but a hesitant, uneven travel. Her head tilted slightly. That alone told her something. She picked up the rifle, rotated it gently, and released the bolt again while her other hand hovered near the chamber. The delay wasn't just feel, it was sound. The action dragged at the midpoint. She flipped open the dust cover, locked the bolt to the rear, and peered inside. Gas tubes bent, she said calmly, about 3 degrees off alignment. Probably from heat stress or deliberate torque. Gas port looks carbon-caked. One of the techs nearby raised his brows. Emily reached for a bore scope. She ran it cleanly through the barrel and paused when she saw the rifling. Chamber scoring. Mild, spiral-patterned. That came from steel case ammo fired in volume, likely unlubed. It wasn't just use, it was abuse. She didn't stop. Next, she pulled the upper and lower apart with practiced ease, pivoting the takedown pins and sliding free the buffer assembly. She ran the buffer spring through a compression gauge, nearly half an inch below minimum spec. It had been intentionally clipped or crushed. Either way, the return cycle would fail at higher rate of fire. She held it up like a museum artifact. Buffers shot. Would induce short stroking, likely causing ejection failures. Coleman leaned against the wall with arms crossed, chewing a toothpick. No reaction. Emily moved to the optic last. She checked the mount screws with a torque wrench, low resistance. Then she noticed fine fractures spidering across the mounting bracket. Scope mounts cracked. You can see the tension line just under the front clamp. Would throw off 0 with the first recoil cycle. She didn't need to keep going, but she did. Trigger pull felt spongy. She opened the lower and exposed the fire control group. There was sand. Fine. Yellow-grain desert particulate, jammed inside the trigger mechanism. Not from carelessness. Someone had packed it in there. She took a step back and laid her gloves on the bench. Without theatrics. Without drama. She looked at Coleman. The weapon isn't just faulty. It was tampered with. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. The room stayed quiet. Most of the crew had stopped pretending to work. Some stood with crossed arms, others with open mouths. No one moved. Coleman's jaw flexed. Just lucky guesses. Anyone could have figured that out. Emily didn't answer, but Coleman's voice rose. You think one broken toy proves something you're not special. You're just another hanger-on. A base rat. Wearing gloves and acting like you matter. She stepped around the bench, wiping her hands with a cloth. Calm and steady. Her eyes didn't change. Didn't darken. Didn't challenge. But there was something about the way she stood now. A straightness in her spine. A balance in her stance. Coleman caught it, too. He pushed off the wall like he'd just realized he was standing too close to. Something hot. The room noticed. The unspoken shift in tension. The knowledge that someone had just demonstrated not skill, but precision. Intimate, surgical precision. Emily walked to the wall, logged the SR-25's condition on a clipboard, then slid it into the intake tray for full teardown. It was already diagnosed. She didn't need to prove anything else. Coleman opened his mouth again, but the insult died halfway out. No one was laughing now. No one followed his lead. At 10:31, Emily turned off her bench light, unbuckled her gloves, and walked to the next weapon on the rack. Her body language hadn't changed, but the room had, and Coleman, for the first time that day, didn't speak. At 11:02, the room snapped from idle to still. Emily had just returned a calibrated torque wrench to its holster when Coleman crossed the yellow safety line, too fast, too close, and too loud. His words weren't new, same spit-polished bravado, but this time something was different. Something in the way he leaned in, voice low, breath sour with provocation. You think you're untouchable just because you fooled a few kids with a wrench. Her left hand tightened around the steel handle. Not consciously, just as instinct. The wrench weighed less than a pound, but balanced right. It would crush orbital bone on contact. She turned slightly, foot sliding back 6 inches. The shift wasn't visible to most, but to anyone trained in CQB posture, it was a stance meant to kill. Her breath shortened. Not panic. Optimization. Diaphragm low, shoulders down, pulse rising but rhythmic. She cataloged everything. Distance to the wall, location of the backup rifle stand, number of witnesses. She assessed Coleman's center line. The tension in his stance. His overconfidence. If she broke his right wrist first, he'd fall toward her dominant side. One clean strike to the throat and he'd be out cold in 3.7 seconds. Her grip flexed once. Her arm pulled slightly. Then something happened. A voice. Not outside. Inside. Rod's voice. Dry. Sarcastic. That same voice from a freezing OP in Kunduz when she nearly executed a captured insurgent too early. He'd said one thing. Don't kill a man just because no one's watching. That memory stopped her like a tripwire. The wrench hovered midair for a breath too long. Coleman hadn't seen it, but others had. Lane had. Wilson had. The silence that filled the bay wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Something ancient in their blood told them they had just stood too close to. Something that could have turned lethal in an instant. Emily inhaled through her nose. Long. Grounded. She lowered her arm. Slowly. Deliberately. Then placed the wrench back on its magnetic strip. The metal clicked into place with a finality that felt heavier than gunfire. Coleman smirked like he'd won something, but nobody mirrored him this time. His laugh rang hollow, forced. He backed away with swagger, but the way his eyes flicked around told the truth. He'd felt it too. That moment where a hand raised meant death, and it had passed him by like a shadow that chose not to fall. Emily turned back to her workstation. She didn't say a word. Her pulse slowed. Her stance eased, but her eyes didn't soften. One of the junior techs whispered, barely audible. She could have ended him. Lane didn't answer. He just looked at the torque wrench like it had grown teeth. The room changed after that. Not in policy, not in protocol, but in reverence. They had seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. A civilian who could dismantle rifles blindfolded. A woman who carried ghosts behind her silence. And today, they had nearly seen her become one more. But she didn't, because restraint is louder than rage. And the strongest weapon in the room is the one that doesn't need to be drawn. At 1338, Lieutenant Commander Wilson sat alone in the observation booth overlooking Bay 6. His eyes followed Emily Graves not like an officer watching a subordinate, but like a man trying to remember something forgotten. There was a rhythm to her motion. Not mechanical, not learned. It was earned, like muscle memory etched from repetition under fire. She moved with her left foot always slightly offset, as if expecting recoil or blast. When the Black Hawk passed overhead earlier, she didn't flinch, but her head had tilted 4 degrees west, just enough to gauge direction, altitude, and descent vector. That wasn't reflex. That was training. Wilson felt his stomach tighten. He'd been near Kandahar in late 2019, overseeing an IED disposal op near Highway 4 when his convoy took indirect fire. A second blast flipped their lead MATV. He remembered being thrown onto the roadside. Vision blurred. Half-deaf. A woman had appeared through the smoke. No insignia. No rank. She moved low, fast, one hand dragging his Cortman, the other scanning for secondaries. She had brown eyes and arms like braided steel. Then she was gone. He never caught her name. At 1342, he locked the booth and made his way to the restricted access room near JAG. His credentials cleared Cybernet after 3 separate authentications. The interface loaded slow, standard for anything that pulled from deep operations folders. He typed in Ghost. The system hesitated, then populated 4 entries, all half-redacted. One stood out. SEAL Team 9, active 2011-2220, status retired, no forwarding assignment, no confirmed location. The profile was gutted, lines of blacked-out metadata, entire operation scrubbed under Section 5.2 of Title 50. But in the middle of it all, a photo, not posed, a still image pulled from helmet cam footage, and there she was. Same jawline, same eyes, a Kevlar collar pulled tight against a throat used to biting cold. Emily Graves. He leaned back in the chair. The mission tag confirmed it, Northern Dan District, 2019. Wilson's own name was in the supplemental report. Unnamed special operator had crossed 400 meters of unsecured terrain during active contact to extract two U.S. Navy personnel. Timing matched his memory to the second, and it wasn't luck. It was her. At 13:55, he shut the monitor. He didn't print, didn't copy, just stared for one more breath at the grainy photo. The legend they used to whisper about in the green rooms, who disappeared without ceremony, was now working beside a pile of stripped-down carbines like none of it mattered. She had saved him. She didn't know it. And still, she showed up every day, quiet and exact, repairing rifles for men who mocked her. Wilson stepped out into the hallway, his mind moving slower than usual. The revelation didn't bring shock or awe. It brought something heavier, a sense of weight, of time. She could have stayed black, could have taken a GS-15 contract or buried herself in a bunker. But instead, she chose this: manual labor, solitude, tools instead of titles. And for the first time in a long while, he felt his throat tighten. Not from protocol or rank, but from the raw shape of truth. She was Ghost, and she had always been here, right in front of them. At 14:08, the range echoed with dry fire and brass clinking on concrete. Wind carried faint echoes from the distant berms. Emily stood near the third station, arms crossed, eyes on a stripped-down M4. She hadn't spoken in hours, just kept to the rhythm, inspect, adjust, reassemble. Then came the voice, Emily Graves. It cut through the noise like a flare at night, clear, steady, carried by authority, but not shouted. Lieutenant Commander Wilson stood at the center of the gravel yard, boots firm in the sand, eyes locked on her. The sound stopped first, then motion. A dozen operators looked up, confused at first, but something in his voice kept them from speaking. Emily turned her head, slight, controlled. She didn't move otherwise. Wilson took 2 steps forward. Everyone here needs to hear this. The quiet deepened. The sky stretched wide and pale. Even the flags at the edge of the field had gone still. 4 years ago, in Kandahar, my team hit an IED grid near Highway 4. We were compromised. Exfil routes collapsed. Our comms were down. Someone came through the smoke, pulled out 2 of my men and carried our corpsmen half a click uphill under. Direct fire that someone disappeared before the birds arrived? He paused. It was her. Nobody spoke. Wilson turned to face the crowd now. She didn't ask for a medal. She didn't stay for thanks. But if you think she's just a contractor with a wrench, you're wrong. She is Ghost. And you all have trained under protocols, she wrote. That zero retention transition drill, the breach room failover cycle you practice every quarter, hers. The reason half of you are alive today, her. Coleman stood frozen. His face had drained of color. His jaw worked, but no sound came. Emily still hadn't spoken. Instead, she stepped forward, slow, deliberate. She rolled up her left sleeve with one motion. Not dramatic, not for effect, just enough to reveal the tattoo, the trident, stylized, worn at the edges. Beneath it, 3 names inked into the flesh with the care of memory. Rodriguez, Chen, Thompson. Someone near the back of the group exhaled like they'd been holding their breath. Lane straightened up. Wilson lowered his voice, but it carried. She doesn't need you to salute her, but I will. And he did, snapped into attention, right palm slicing to brow. Not as an order, not from protocol, but from something older, something truer. One by one, the others followed, not quickly, not all at once, but slowly, deliberately, as understanding spread like fire across the gravel. Boots closed, spines lifted, eyes held steady. And by 14:11, there wasn't a sound on the range but wind moving past a dozen men standing it. Attention before a woman who never asked to be seen. Emily didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her name had already echoed. And now, finally, it was heard. At 14:15, the formation on the range held its silence like a held breath. Coleman remained on one knee, not by command, but by something heavier. His hands trembled just enough to betray the weight pressing on him. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, finally, his voice broke through the stillness. Thompson was my cousin. His words came out raw, shredded like fabric torn from too much weight. Wilson turned his head slightly. Emily froze. Her left hand, still resting near her bicep, curled into her sleeve. Coleman looked down at the gravel. James Thompson. He used to call me Little Ray when we were kids. He joined the Navy before I could. He was the reason I signed up. I followed his footsteps like they were scripture. No one interrupted. I knew who you were from the first week you walked in here. You moved like someone who'd seen real fire. But it wasn't until I saw your tattoo that I knew for sure. I recognized his name. My mom showed me the casualty list. You were the last one they mentioned." He paused, swallowed. "I hated you for it." His voice cracked, but he didn't look up. "You lived. He didn't. I saw the reports. You dragged him out. You tried. I know that. But it didn't matter. I couldn't handle the thought that the only person who came home wasn't blood, wasn't family. I wanted someone to blame. You were there. You survived. So I made you my enemy." Emily's lips parted. No sound came out. Just breath. Coleman's hands clenched tighter on his knees. "Every day I watched you in that bay. Quiet, focused, unshaken. And it made me sick. Because I wanted to see you crack. I wanted proof that you hurt the way I did, but you didn't. You never gave me that, so I poked. I pushed. I wanted to break you just to feel less broken myself." His shoulders shook once. "You didn't break." Emily stepped forward, slow as falling snow. She said nothing, just stood a few feet from him, eyes fixed not in anger but in something deeper. Her breath had shortened, the way it did when pain wasn't physical. He looked up. "I'm sorry." 3 words that didn't fix anything, but hung there with the weight of a man finally admitting he'd been drowning. In grief, she knelt down, not in weakness, not in forgiveness yet, just to be on the same level. Her eyes glistened, not from anger, but memory. James carried the rear that day. We both knew someone had to. He smiled before he turned, told me to keep moving. His rifle jammed after the second volley. I didn't leave him. I dragged him until I couldn't anymore. She looked down at her forearm. Her voice was barely audible. I remember his blood more than his voice, but I remember the smile. Coleman nodded, jaw clenched hard. He couldn't speak again. His hand pressed into the gravel, anchoring himself. Emily whispered, "I lived, but pieces of me didn't, and I carried his name so I wouldn't forget which ones." No one else moved. No one else dared break the moment. Then Emily did something none of them expected. She placed her hand over his. Not tightly, not in ceremony, just enough to say, "I see you, and I hurt too." Coleman bowed his head, and the range, for the first time all day, felt like sacred ground. Forgiveness doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it arrives in silence. At 06:27, the hangar lights buzzed to life over Range 14. No cameras, no brass, no announcements. Just 12 female service members standing in loose formation beside stacked gear crates and sand-filled dummies. Emily stood in front of them wearing a plain khaki range jacket and zero insignia. Coleman stood 2 paces behind, clipboard in hand, eyes steady. She spoke quietly. "This isn't about recognition. You won't get a ribbon for this. What I teach you comes from a place no ceremony will ever reach." There was no applause, just silence, the kind that meant they were listening. At 06:35, they began the first circuit, weighted drag drills with full kit rescue dummies. Each dummy weighed 240 pounds. Emily didn't explain twice. She showed once. Low stance, forearm under the harness strap, leverage, not force. Pivot the hips, plant your back foot, move 5 feet, rest, move again. One recruit groaned after the first rep. Emily nodded. "That sound is your body learning where the edge is. Now teach it to stay there." Coleman called the next rotation. Station 2 focused on applied leverage for hand-to-hand scenarios. Emily demonstrated how a smaller operator could throw a full-grown man off balance using knee placement and foot traps. It wasn't flashy. It was physics. She walked the line and corrected stances without barking. She didn't lecture. She adjusted weight distribution, nodded once, and stepped back. That was enough. At 07:12, they rotated to blindfolded weapon clearing, M4 platforms. Malfunction drills, one in the chamber simulation. Emily sat cross-legged beside the gear crates and let her voice carry without force. Out there, steel doesn't care if you're male or female. It reacts to grip, pressure, timing. Learn those. You live. Next, they moved to the aircraft simulator. Inside the T-6 Texan II mock-up, each trainee had 15 minutes to identify forward observation targets under simulated cloud and wind shift. Emily supervised, headset on. No eye contact. Just notes, data, small corrections. At 08:03, one trainee missed a simulated convoy beneath fog cover. Emily paused the feed. If you miss the movement pattern, you miss the IED trigger man. He doesn't carry weight. He carries time. The recruits didn't flinch. They rewound and ran it again. Coleman stayed quiet unless she asked for a readout. His clipboard was filled with notations. He never interrupted, never rolled his eyes. He knew now what kind of ground they were walking on. By 08:30, sweat soaked through shirts, arms hung heavy, but no one quit. because they weren't being screamed at. They were being led, not with slogans, with silence, and by example. Emily stepped to the side and finally said what none of them expected. "This is a one-time offer. I don't repeat courses. I don't stay for handshakes. If you need what I taught, use it. If not, forget I was here." They didn't speak. They just stood taller, because leadership didn't need to be loud. It needed to be real. At 06:42, Coleman stood by the rope station, stopwatch in hand, as one of the trainees climbed with quiet focus. Her arms shook, but her footing held. He didn't yell, didn't rush, just watched. When she reached the top and slapped the beam, he wrote a checkmark without fanfare. Something in him had shifted. He no longer measured performance against ego. He looked for effort, control, resilience. The same things he used to mock in silence now grounded him. During a break at 07:20, he sat beside Emily near the mobile aid station, both sipping from dented canteens. The morning sun cut through the clouds, soft over the tarmac. "My daughter turns 12 this fall. Said she wants to go Navy one day." Emily didn't blink. "Then help build the kind of Navy she deserves to walk into." There was no lecture, no metaphor, just that one sentence. It stayed with him longer than any command ever had. He started walking the line differently, not as a watchdog, but as a mirror. He adjusted belts, offered extra sets on the pull-ups, gave quiet nods instead of orders. The trainees didn't avoid his gaze anymore. They looked at him with something new. Trust. At 08:55 during the final exercise, a combined stress course of casualty drag, comms under pressure, and simfire corrections. 3 of the female candidates crossed the line in under target time. Breathing ragged, faces streaked with sweat, but eyes alive. It wasn't just performance, it was presence. They had absorbed something bigger than technique. Emily logged the scores without ceremony. Coleman watched her, then turned to the squad. 3 passed. That's the highest we've ever seen. He said it without shock, just quiet pride. The rest of the base didn't know. There wouldn't be a banner or a ceremony. But in that range, in that hour, something fundamental had shifted. Not just in the numbers, but in one man who used to sneer, and in the system he now helped rebuild. One step at a time. At 04:58, the range was quiet. The final course logs had been filed, gear locked up. The footprints from the last training drill still faintly marked the gravel, near Station 4, but Emily was gone. No farewell, no flag, just a silent absence that left the air still. By 06:00, the only trace of her was a sealed manila folder on Wilson's desk. Inside, no rank, no contact info, just a handwritten line on plain paper. "If she's ready, tell her to call the number on back, only once. Use my name. She'll know what it means." It was signed with a trident and the initials EG. By the end of the month, rumors had spread of an anonymous non-profit funding rifle optics for female marksmen in New Mexico. In North Carolina, a PTSD recovery center received a pallet of customized sim rigs for neural recall therapy. The shipping label read Ghost Foundation. No other info, just that name. At 08:12, Coleman stood alone at the west side of the base. He had built the space himself over 2 weekends. Nothing fancy, just earth, gravel, and 3 wooden posts under a sloping tree. At the center stood a single trident welded from steel. Not polished, not perfect. The metal still held the dark burn marks from the torch. Around it, 3 birds carved from driftwood had been placed carefully in open flight. A cardinal, a blue jay, a hawk. No plaques. No ranks, just presence. He didn't pray. He just stood still. When the breeze lifted, the birds didn't move. But something inside him did. 3 weeks later, in a quiet gun shop outside Kalispell, Montana, Wilson walked in under a sky lined with smoke from distant pines. The bell over the door rang once. Behind the counter, Emily sat hunched over an old M14 bolt stripped, chamber open, a bore light casting gold down the length of the barrel. She looked up, eyes calm. Wilson said nothing at first, he just waited. She handed him a sealed envelope. Her words were almost a whisper. "That's for Thompson's girl. If she ever wants to serve, send her my way. Or someone like me. Quiet ones still get the job done." Wilson nodded. Then she went back to cleaning. By 05:00 every morning, locals said, they'd see a lone figure jogging the northern ridge. Not on the trail. In the open dirt, 3 miles, always the same loop. No watch, no music. Just motion. She carried a small pouch at her hip. Inside were 3 spent brass casings, each one from a different mission, each one tied to a name. Rodriguez, Chen, Thompson. No one asked what they meant. But every morning, without fail, the ghost still ran. and the world moved just a little better for it.